All right. Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here at 4 o'clock on the next to last day of this conference. It's been great. It's been a lot of talking. I often joke with students when I meet with them that like you're not getting your best and bright me at right, Erin, the librarian at 4 o'clock. You've all been warned, but we hope that this is going to be a good conversation. So hopefully you're all here for the data mining and delivery via API talk, and we're going to discuss some challenges and strategies for future collection development. So I'm Erin Wakowitz. I am the librarian for business and management at Yale University Library. With me to my left, your left, to my right, is Dan Hickey. He is the head of the business and real estate libraries at New York University. And coming from beyond, or from her home, is our colleague, Kelly LeBoyce, who could not be here today. Kelly is the associate director of the Walker Management Library at Vanderbilt University. Oh, and you're making the slides go. Those are coming from beyond too. Excellent. So today we're going to spend some time talking about some functional challenges related to data and collection development. We're then going to talk about some conceptual challenges. We're going to talk about some strategies and solutions, and then hopefully have time for a Q&A at the end and just to explore this interesting topic. And Dan and I are both just going to sit, because it's like kind of tight and weird in this room, so we're just going to kind of sit here and have a discussion with this, and so that is how we're going to move forward. So first, we'll start with a little bit of introduction to the topic, and really we want to introduce this as more of a how do these kinds of questions present themselves as a collection issue. And yeah. All right, so how it usually starts, right? So this is an actual collection question or consultation that I had very shortly after I started at Yale several years ago. So it starts off innocently enough. I get this email from a faculty member who's interested in starting this project to compare countries' resilience on nuclear power, no big deal, and how that shapes response to nuclear accidents. Sounds pretty standard. And they go on, right? They want to compile major newspaper articles and business press coverage of Chernobyl, complete with alternative spellings, and Fukushima, also, from publications in France, Germany, and the UK. So now it's like starting to get a little weird. We'll move on. Ideally, we want to get all articles mentioning the events directly and anything describing attitudes towards nuclear power between 1980 and today. So this is like from 2014, right? And so also, can we use Factiva for this? That's like the other fun piece, right? Because they thought, and I understand, like, I see where their head was going. Like, the content was largely there. There's good international coverage, but like, we're not really able to download hundreds of thousands of articles from Factiva for a number of reasons. Be it just like, you know, there's like what, you can download 100 at a time. There's also that pesky license that says, yeah, you can't do that. So I think what this question, as much as we all laugh at it, it does sort of illustrate some of the real world problems that we're seeing in terms of data as a collection development situation for us, right? So we're seeing an increase in requests for both text and numeric data across all disciplines. So ironically, this was from a business school faculty member as well. Yeah, and really what we're seeing is not only with that increased standard files, so I think we would often see back in the day in our collections, flat files, cataloged for like a period of time, a static file or download that we paid for a special extract or a cut of data. That's not even really doing the trick anymore, right? So we're starting to get faculty wanting current data, so thinking about like microdata or tick data. And they want a lot of it, you know, a few 100,000 articles. And they're already interacting with our collections like this, right? So we have people actively trying to, you know, download a lot of content from our existing databases, like Factiva. Could also be Hoover's, LexisNexis metadata. We're seeing this a lot in full text downloads. There's a huge demand for that as well. In business, we're seeing a lot of interest in text for textual analysis as a source of academic interest, specifically things like annual reports to shareholders, conference call transcripts, quarterly earnings, and you know, to do that, we're starting to see a need for APIs or API-like solutions. We have API or data feed type products that actually already exist for some of those databases like Factiva, Hoover's, and LexisNexis. It's just sometimes getting those is not as easy. So like just because you subscribe to one product doesn't mean you have access to this other piece, right? So just for the sake of making this really easy, this is a non-technical discussion. API, or Application Programming Interface, we're really just talking about a mechanism for one software to talk to another software to like transmit data. We're not going to get any more technical than that in this. We're not going to be talking about writing code. We'll also talk about data feeds. So we'll talk about that as a product or a mechanism, a way for users to receive continually updated data sources as we get into some of these functional challenges. And working with these types of sources has been a challenge for a lot of libraries and librarians, simply because it kind of breaks that mold for collecting like data as an item or a data as a book. And so we need to start thinking about, do we need to think about new approaches for acquisitions and collecting these types of, or adding this type of content to our collections? And really, are we trying to force new modes of research into sort of our old paradigms for collection development, and what would it look like if we could maybe move forward? So we are going to move forward to some foundational challenges, and this is where you're going to hear the voice from beyond. And we have a quick clip we're going to play.
Thanks, Dan and Erin. I'm going to talk about 3 of the most common challenges for this type of collection development: issues with price, licensing, and access. One of the biggest challenges for pricing is that there are often multiple platforms for the same content that serve different use cases. We're used to the concept of buying data twice. I'm sure we've all duplicated a print book with an ebook, but when pricing is tens of thousands of dollars for duplicate content, it can be really challenging to get stakeholders to understand why we need these other formats. The best format for classroom teaching and learning might not be the best format for a researcher. A vendor may not allow one product to meet both needs when they can sell 2 different products. Examples of this would be subscribing to datasets on WORDS, the Wharton Research Data Services platform, for something like SDC or Prequent, then also subscribing to one of their products with user interface. Another example would be a product like CalcBench or FactSet, where you pay for initial access, but then you're charged more fees, potentially double the base subscription, to get access to the API. Next, I'm going to talk about a few challenging clauses that can show up in licenses for datasets, especially when the vendors who sell them primarily work with commercial businesses. Vendors may want to wish to review any academic papers that would be published using their data. I've seen these clauses come up a lot in licenses over the last 3 years. This really infringes on academic freedom. A vendor may want to verify how much raw data is shared in a paper or that credit is attributed to them, but they also may want the ability to make changes about what you are suggesting based on the data. Quote, good faith, quote, suggestions. Some vendors may even charge an additional fee for your subscription per paper that's published. Another clause you'll see is delete and destroy data. This may give you a grace period to finish up a paper, maybe it's 1 to 3 years, but it means that the author is not able to save any of their data, and if they want to do a project in the future that builds on it, they have to resubscribe and they don't get any credit for what they paid for that year. Lastly, I'm going to talk about maintenance fees from both the vendor side and your institution. For vendors to maintain interfaces, they may charge you a maintenance fee. My colleagues will dive deeper into this idea of data as a service in a little bit. However, there's also fees from your own institution that may apply when you're looking for data sets and you need to figure out how you're going to transfer, host, and store that data. A researcher may not have built this in the budget. Maybe the library hasn't built it in the budget, and the costs aren't always transparent when you're trying to figure out the total size of the data and what platform is going to store the data and how often people are going to need that live connection. You may need to work with multiple departments on your campus to set that up. There can also be limitations to products like this. For example, an API may be slow. API throttling is the process of limiting the number of requests the user can make in a period. And when a lot of individuals are sharing central accounts, this can happen. You also may have limitations when a vendor has to manually transfer content. Maybe they're digitizing files that exist in one format into another that's more readily available for text mining. And they tell you it could take a minimum of 6 months to a year. That may be too long for the researcher and they abandon the project. The library reviews contracts a lot, and I think we have a really special set of skills to push back on some of these challenges. And we know how to anticipate needs of researchers, instructors, and students. If your college or an individual faculty member with a grant or special funds is subscribing, they might not know what to push back on, so I always recommend, even if it's not a library acquisition, use your skill set because you have value to the equation and come into the process, and don't let someone sign a license that you know is going to limit a researcher. My last foundational challenge here is access, because unfortunately the models for data products usually are not unlimited, simultaneous, remote users with unlimited download privileges. Why do vendors limit downloads? Especially commercial vendors may not understand a researcher use case. We need big data sets to look for statistical insights and patterns. There could be a paranoia that others will download all of their proprietary data and create a product to compete or replace with them in the market. And this cascades into other challenges. Many vendors work with third-party data providers, and they aggregate all of this together for us in a platform. They may be worried about protecting themselves in the agreements that they've signed. An example might be a firm like Rave Impact, which does text sentiment analysis, licensing Wall Street Journal data. Or someone like Bloomberg, who licenses data from dozens and dozens of different sources, and especially a few new ESG acquisitions that they're very sensitive about. With these access issues, one vendor potential suggestion is they create a product where the researcher is unable to take content out of their platform and put it in another. A product that you might have heard of that wants their data to live in this walled garden could be ProQuest TDM, Nexus Data Lab, or even Bloomberg. This can be challenging when a researcher has one coding language or tool of choice. Maybe they're using SPSS, or maybe they're coding in Python. And if they're not able to export content into the tool they're used to using, they're forced to use whatever metrics are in this interface that may or may not make sense for them. This can also cause challenges when we end up in the library using what I'll call a workbench model, where we have a couple seats to one of these platforms where you can't export data. How long will you let people check it out? We know an academic research project can move really slowly, but if a researcher can't export that data, they might need to keep their seat until their project's done. There's a lot of security issues on both sides related to this. You might get a very generous vendor who recognizes our financial limits and says that you can buy one account and have a shared username and password and give it to different students and faculty to download the data they need. But this makes us vulnerable in the library because if a patron does something against a license, maybe they're downloading for commercial use, it's harder for us to police that and make sure we're maintaining our agreements. So now I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues. We're going to dive deeper into some of the conceptual differences between librarians and vendors that can make collection development in this area challenging.
So thank you for listening to our video from Kelly. Kelly is here on Zoom, and she is going to be with us for the Q&A. We just wanted to make sure that you could hear her entire part of the presentation. So I'm Dan Hickey, I'm from NYU, and I'm going to talk a little bit now about the conceptual challenges. I think a lot of the logistical challenges are interesting because we think about how we address them within different areas of the university. So for example, Kelly at Vanderbilt is integrated into the business school, and she has a lot of autonomy in deciding how and when she can sign a license. Whereas Erin and I are within centralized libraries where we really do need to be licensing for the entire university. So we see things from kind of very different perspectives when it comes to those logistical challenges. Oftentimes, if I can't do something, for example, I'm working with someone within the business school who does have the autonomy to sign on to a product that Kelly, for example, could sign on to at Vanderbilt on her own. In terms of the conceptual challenges, I think that this is where our stakeholders within the university are all at different levels. And when I talk about stakeholders, I mean our people who work in our collections departments, our liaison librarians, and our people within the schools themselves and the researchers. So one we've already talked about a bit in terms of logistics, which is thinking about data not as an object, but as a stream. And so this is already kind of like mainstream thought in computer science, but in libraries very much we are still of the kind of mindset of download the 2022 flat file, put it in the institutional repository, and we don't need to think about that data product for another year. Now I think there's really a shift in the scholarship where our faculty are really, and our researchers are really thinking about having that instant and continual flow of data and being able to look at it via something like machine learning or artificial intelligence. And so that's one of like the key conceptual paradigm shifts that we're seeing. And so one example of this is NYU has something called the Volatility Lab. It's a website where they're using multiple different APIs to pull in financial and economic indicators. They massage them on the back end, do a lot of calculations, and then they're publishing kind of an atypical piece of scholarship, which is a website that visualizes these volatility indicators for the world. It's the kind of thing that like librarians immediately get like, oh yeah, that's scholarship, that's gonna count towards your 10-year portfolio. But sometimes I think their faculty colleagues don't understand the value of that, that kind of product. And so we had a product called DataStream. The legacy product was one of those ingest points that we had for the VLabs website. And that product was sunsetted, and now we had to find a new API because the new DataStream API products are just flat out too expensive to sustain that. And so that's the type of scholarship that we really want to be supporting, but we don't necessarily have easy products that can manage it. And then did you want to talk about your example?
Yes, so we talked about like that classic data stream model, and from the Refinitiv products, what we were seeing towards the end of its life cycle, and in retrospect, looking back on this experience that we had at Yale, it should have signified that the new model was going to be wildly different, because it used to be, we looked at our old contracts and everything, there was no indication that there were any download limits at all for this particular product. However, we got this interesting phone call from a representative from Refinitiv telling us we were downloading too much data and in violation of our contracts. Peculiar. So then to get us like sort of back into compliance was we were told we could buy a separate product that would, it was basically giving them more money in order to continue to use this platform in the same manner that we always had been, and many other colleagues across numbers of institutions were using it. Now, under the new product and its delivery mechanism in the Refinitiv Workspace platform, there are tiers and download limitations for students and for faculty. So, in retrospect, like I said, I should have seen the writing on the wall and what this meant. It was really a sign of things to come, and it didn't happen to every institution also. There were 2 others that I was aware of that received that sort of unfortunate phone call. But that was just sort of a sign of how this is getting even more complicated with those those platform models rather for data.
Can I tell your joke?
Please.
Okay, so the joke here is that the product is called DataStream, and they wanted to throttle her back on using data as a stream. We love you, Refinitiv, but that one was a little tough. The next conceptual challenge we have is the perception of buying things twice, which is something that Kelly already mentioned. The library perspective is often that we are subscribing to this data already, we can't buy it again in a more expensive wrapper. And the vendor perspective is one that I have varying levels of sympathy for, which is this is a service that you're paying for. You're not buying data and owning it outright. You're subscribing to a service that is delivering value to your researchers. And I bristle at it. I think a lot of people in library land bristle, but I'm also starting to get it. Oh, did you want to say something? Or just stretching, sorry. I saw the hand go up and I was like, yeah! All right. Sorry for our online people who can't, maybe didn't see the hand go. So I think like this is something that there's always going to be a tension on this front. And I think it's one of those cases where letting all of your stakeholders know about this tension and representing the vendor perspective within your library is really going to help pay off in spades when it comes to talking about why we need this particular data in this particular format, even though we already have a product that has exactly the same name. So some examples of the perception of buying things twice are PitchBook. PitchBook is a popular private equity and venture capital database, and the API access is free, but you can only really use the API if you have a faculty researcher account, which costs an additional fee every year. And then on top of that, is Jennifer in the room?
Yep.
Hey, Jennifer. Jennifer was talking about how her faculty member wanted an actual data stream from PitchBook. So there are additional levels of direct data flow that you can get. So there's the option through Words, which, Cynthia, do you have PitchBook via Words at Penn? Okay, I thought someone just bought it. I thought it was you. But then you can also get this more direct data feed from the vendor. And so this is a complicated product landscape. It is technically all the same data. It's just a case of what are the levers that you can actually push as an end user to get the data that you need out of it. And then we were talking a little bit about Refinitiv, and we were kind of, like burning them a little bit, but I would say like not too much, because one of the things that's interesting about Refinitiv is that they're one of the few vendors that actually has options that they're advertising to our researchers to be able to interact with a lot of the different data that they have in this way. So for example, like we're already buying the analyst reports that they have. We're already buying the conference call transcripts. We're already buying all of this stuff, but they also are the only game in town. Well, not true, Standard & Poor's has some stuff. But they're really the only game in town when it comes to interacting with these text and these documents as data itself. Although there is always the use case of our students are very smart and they can scrape the data themselves if only there weren't those controls put in place. Go ahead.
Yeah, and this has come off of an earlier session this afternoon. Some of you might have been, and we were talking about alternative fundings and partnerships. At Yale, we do have our School of Management subscribes to one of those Refinitiv fees for the street events, conference transcripts, which is great. Glad they can afford that and manage that and do that until there's like some staff turnover, and then they're contacting me to figure out how they can get these from FTP. Don't have the documentation, I do now. But again, it sort of just complicates what's already sort of a gnarly landscape when they're already frustrated that they can't get access through an existing product that the library's already providing access to. They come up with their own solution, and then there are further challenges with that. So.
Thanks. The next conceptual challenge we want to talk about is the idea of actually interacting with these products and creating services to support them. So a lot of our products, when we bring them on board, are products that we can rely on access through very standard library access workflows. And so I think now we need to think about this change as mediated access to these data products and what that actually means for our services and also for the identities of our service providers. So in some ways, I think there's a conceptual challenge where our patrons don't even necessarily understand these products ourselves. Like we joke about how like we're not really going to go into the technical aspects of what an API is and like how you're going to have to use something like Python to query it. But patrons oftentimes see these products and they think, wow, that's the Cadillac, I want that. And they don't realize that they're so far away from actually being able to use it, and even to be brought through all the steps by a library service provider, that it almost seems like an insurmountable problem. I think there's also a question of the role of the librarian who's assisting. So you rapidly approach a situation where you can be helping, moving far beyond what you would normally do with a patron, to the point where you're accomplishing their research for them when it comes to these data mining and API products. Because there are hundreds of tiny decisions that are being made when you're thinking about what product to select and how you're actually going to use it. So the classic example that our vendors here is can't I just pay you more for you to clean and analyze my data for me? And the same thing happens with librarians, which is, can't you just pull the data that I want for me from the product? And as Erin's original example from Factiva shows you, it's like at least those people were thinking through every part of the step and they had identified the product. But for a lot of people, they just kind of want the data set that comes out of these products to appear. And I think like that's where the information and data literacy piece comes in. Okay, and do you want to do your example here of this?
Oh yeah, of course. And so I think what also complicates matters too is that level of support that comes with, or that's necessary for using these types of products and working with data. There are some institutions that are incredibly fortunate that their libraries have very highly trained teams of librarians and other staff to clean and analyze their data and compile it for them. I can think of two offhand, I'm not going to name shame anyone, but where that becomes a problem is, say somebody went and did their PhD at a school or worked at a school, then they come to your institution and are expecting that same level of service and support for working with data. You can't provide that. I mean, I am a 2-woman shop at Yale for business, and that is for the entire School of Management and anybody else who has fleeting interests in business-ish stuff, including entrepreneurship. So, and same thing with Dan. I mean, I think we don't have teams as robust as some other institutions, and we certainly don't have a team that can actually compile these data sets. And oh, by the way, in that original introduction question, they did ask me if I would be the one to download all the questions for them and build the searches. So.
I spoke too soon and giving them kudos.
Okay.
I would say the other thing that this mediated access or gatekeeper access issue brings up is the idea of do liaison librarians have the skills to actually assist, to actually help with closing the loop with these products. So at NYU, we just hired an economic and financial data analysis librarian. Such a boutique title, please don't anyone else hire one. It's what we had to call it to get it approved, right? It's a business data librarian, it's a social science data librarian position, essentially. And I know Cynthia also has a business data librarian as well at Penn. And I think it's one of these things where more and more, well, we're business librarians, so we see more and more that business librarians need data skills. And I think that we're seeing this in the social sciences and the sciences as well, where the definition of what a liaison or a disciplinary or a subject librarian needs to be able to do is changing in a way that, we've always said that oh, perhaps this is the responsibility of our data services colleagues. But now we want to buy all the stuff, and our researchers want to use all the stuff that requires this. And so it's really going to impact, I think, not just logistically, how we're doing collections work, how we're doing the data storing work that is kind of already unlocked at a lot of places, but also it's really changing our own identities, which is kind of, it's kind of intimidating. And then finally under here, I think we need to acknowledge the reality of how scholarship is being done. There are co-authors at other organizations, there's the question of reproducibility, and there's also thinking about academic permitted uses. I heard that at another session there was a really fantastic discussion from someone from Neural who was talking about permitted uses for data that was kind of directly relevant to this whole thing. I think that acknowledging of how scholarship is really being done in the present moment really hammers home that a lot of these conceptual challenges, we're not approaching this just from X, Y, and Z product, X, Y, and Z product with a specific name. We really need to approach it from this conceptual area of the nature of scholarship is changing. The library can't be left behind. We need to be prepared. So that brings us to strategies and solutions. So I think the first thing is to admit that different organizations have different abilities to help right Erin and Kelly and I are lucky that we're at an organization where we've been able to get our hands dirty and roll up our sleeves with a lot of these products. But we all have different levels of ability to respond. So for example, like Kelly in many ways has gone the deepest with a lot of these because she has, you know, one-time funds that she can commit to one-off projects like this. The other thing to keep in mind, for example, we mentioned those two universities that have huge staffs that already help with these kind of things and give white glove service. But the thing to keep in mind is that those elite solutions are really not sustainable at 99% of universities. And even what we're doing right now is not sustainable. It's sustainable for a small cadre of products, but it's not sustainable if we really want to grow and advance on this front. And so that's one reason why we really need to move to the next step. And in that way, I think like it's our responsibility to begin advocating for new workflows that mainstream this into the collections work that we're doing. It's funny, I mentioned this in another presentation that I did with Cynthia, that's why I keep mentioning Cynthia. In our collections manual at NYU, are any of my NYU colleagues here? Okay, there are some of them at this conference, so like I don't want to scandalize them. But the data section of our selectors handbook, our collection development handbook at NYU, is literally blank right now. And it's like we're revising it in this present moment, and it's like we're gonna think about this. Like I think there's a draft now, but like as we begin going through that process of revising, I think the people who are in this room and who are interested in this issue, like make sure that you have a seat at the table and that you're talking this through and that you're bringing your data librarians into this discussion as well. Because if we're not prepared, we're really going to be kind of locked into that, you know, like monograph and serials only kind of mindset that it's really easy to get locked into when it comes to collections work. The next strategy and solution is to work with stakeholders and vendors to understand needs. So the liaison librarian is really the person at the center of all of these different stakeholders that is charged with understanding all of their different needs. And so I think that's why liaison librarians are particularly well situated to be doing this type of advocacy work, because oftentimes, like if you're the head of collections, the idea that you're interfacing directly with a researcher about a data product that they want, usually you don't want to be in that situation, right? You want to be back of house. But I think like thinking about communication between these parties as a two-way street and representing a growing need is super important. And so we can explain the barriers to adoption here for collection development specialists and talk about, you know, like what are the new options. And the other thing we can do is we can work directly with vendors to create solutions that will work for the higher education market. So I think one thing we often see, and the Factiva example is particularly useful, because Factiva as a practitioner interface, you can't scrape it, the data in there, you just look at it with your eyes. Yes. And many people in this room have probably had their Factiva subscription shut down because you've had students who have been scraping that data set because it's got the Wall Street Journal and a lot of people want to use it. The Factiva API product is extremely, extremely, extremely expensive. For the longest time, we didn't know anyone who had actually used it except one Nobel laureate at NYU who got it for free because he's a Nobel laureate. So it's one of those things where it's like, it was like a ghost ship. We were like, someone's used this Factiva API, but not anybody we know, right? And now NYU, very excitingly, is working with Dow Jones, who owns the Factiva platform and works with ProQuest. They're working on a product for the higher education market that will allow you to do this text mining. It's not super fancy, but it's really going to be something that is affordable and within our price range. I don't want to say how much the Factiva API one-off product or one-off project cost is because it's very high, but the JSON export product is going to be priced in a way that we can actually begin to do the work that our license agreement does not allow our end users to. So reach out to your Dow Jones rep. It's coming. It's not done though. And then finally, working with stakeholders. I think like Kelly did a good job of talking through all of the different kind of very restrictive licensing terms that we really need to be pushing back hard against. And I think what we see with these data products is that we begin with a very general, a new product may have a very general license agreement, might be super permissive. And so the first 2 people who sign on to that product get this great license that lets them do anything under the sun with it. Then it begins, the lawyers get involved, and they begin to lock down the product. They begin to put down all of these throttles, all of these holds, all these terms on it. And then even further down the road, due to library advocacy, they begin to liberalize it, open it up. I don't know how many times I've thought to myself, like, someone must be buying this already. Can you send me your contract? Like, does your contract have a non-disclosure agreement in it? If it doesn't, are you willing to show it to me? And that's how oftentimes you actually get the license through the review process. And I think if you can say like, well, this didn't work for me, vendor, but I know that Aaron has it, I know that Kelly has it, can we go back and look at their contract to be able to get it here? Another solution, explaining to patrons how and when to move beyond the library's collections. So a lot of people have ideas when they're doing this type of research, and they may be hyper fixated on a particular product to do it, but there are a lot of freely and publicly available APIs that can connect you with large amounts of data. MIT has the best guide that I've seen of API products, and it includes the stuff that they've licensed, but it also includes freely available stuff. Yes, for those of you who are going to your phone, that's the right thing to do. The MIT APIs for scholarly research, I think is what it's called, and it's amazing. And I've based a lot of my own practice and a lot of my own web presence on what they've done, consolidating all of the different documentation that's necessary for people to understand how to use the API, which is one of the most challenging things. And I think like a lot of our patrons do get it. They have a lot of hustle, and so they're willing to figure out what skills that they need, and they're also willing to locate the expertise, but we don't want that burden to always be on the end user. And so I think we can be creating relationships and using our relationships to be able to facilitate this scholarship. And that's really the end goal, is to be facilitating the scholarship that these collections and this work permits us to do. Oh, I did have one last point, sorry. So my last point is reframing discussions about these data products and these data practices for people to better understand kind of what we're working with. So representing the end user when that is imperative and kind of people are shutting down conversations, representing the vendor's perspective, because a lot of these things are really expensive and they can be abused. I think we've always, some of us have really heard horror stories on our listservs of products that now you have to sign terms of service every time you use it at this particular institution because something went terribly wrong, for example. So I think the reframing of the mindset and those key, sharing those key conceptual things are particularly useful when we try to build a more data inclusive collection development practice.
All right, so I think we can now just sort of summarize, bring it on home, and open it up to questions. But really, I think some of the biggest takeaways that we really want to emphasize is just sort of that rethinking older collection frameworks and start thinking differently about data in our collections. And that can be recognizing that tension, again, between the vendor perspective, or we're licensing a service to you, and the library's perspective of we're buying data. Two very different points of view, and somewhere the reality that makes our researchers successful is in the middle. So thinking about that, being aware of it whenever we're entering in these conversations. The tension between data as an object and data as a continual live stream is something that I think we always have to consider and keep in mind, especially in all of our conversations, both with our research community as well as our own colleagues within the library. And I think we're a little behind in sort of having some of these conversations with our colleagues. So we really do need to push these issues into the fore in collection development forums in our local libraries. And we need to get more people in the room, both from our library systems and the schools and departments that we're serving, to make sure that we're able to advocate for our users. And then finally, just reframing reframing expectations. All of our own, our researchers, vendors, basically everything. And thinking about this, just it's not traditional collection development anymore. We need to own the agency that we have and think about how we can actually influence others to come up with solutions that will actually work for everyone. And instead of thinking about a lot of these licenses and working with these vendors, and I know it's so easy to say, because that trap of like seeing them as sort of the problem and there's nothing but roadblocks, but how can we work to solvable opportunities instead, or solvable problems with opportunities for improving the situation. So that is really all we have for now, and we have time for questions, and Kelly's here if you have any questions about her licensing. Though I don't know if you can see her, you will see her in a minute, I promise she's here. And someone will come around with a mic if there are questions. We have a few minutes, and we'll stay as long as anybody wants us to.
We're going to use the microphone for all questions, or if you want to speak out, we'll summarize your response. And Kelly, if you're still there, you can start your video if you like. I'm going to pin her.
Hi, I have a question. I'm Marcella Tam. Actually, I'm from MIT, and thank you so much for mentioning your praise for. I'm a collection strategist for Arts and Humanities, and I have a special focus on tangible collection. But I was actually part of the team that wrote documentation on all this API stuff, and it was so much work. And like you said, there's just a level of subject expertise that I, as a subject liaison, don't have. But another thing, actually, we changed our website, and it's not the website. We changed. So at MIT, we call these tools computational tools. And so if you go to libguides.mit.edu/comp tools, I think you'll get to that resource page that you mentioned. Yeah.
Gorgeous. It's still gorgeous.
Yeah. It was so much work. Another thing I just want to mention, we are still in the assessment phase of all these new APIs that we purchased. We got Web of Science Expanded API, TDM Studio, Consultation, all these different kind of computational tools. And we call these computational tools because it gives us access, digital and computational access to digital collections that we already own. So we have like a bunch of like WordPress collections, we have a ton of JSON content. And these tools allow us a way to kind of get more value out of the collections that we already subscribe to. So I was really interested to hear you say about like, it's not just we're subscribing to like multiple buckets of content, but we're kind of enhancing the value, and I think that's like really valuable for stakeholders and like higher level library leadership to understand that, yeah, we're actually kind of maximizing the value of our collection. And I guess sort of like to end my kind of like long-winded comment, but like it's actually a very real issue at MIT where, because someone who has an MIT affiliation is working at a .com or like an entrepreneurship, and they want to download like tons of data, and these are like proprietary data like Airbnb data or something like really sensitive, and we need to mediate it, and it's a lot of work. We're still going through the process of like how much resources that we need to put in that kind of mediation, and we are not one of the two universities that you mentioned that have. And we don't have like a dedicated team. It's the liaisons, it's the collection strategists to do it. So I don't know. I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about how you see kind of the proprietary data, these expensive proprietary data sources, and how might libraries kind of work with the researchers to, or like outside of the community, because you know institutions have like this kind of aura, like we need to provide services not just to the researchers, but like community as a whole, like, you know, for society and all that.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so Cynthia and my talk, Disciplinary Data Ascendant, is all about kind of like it's one of the virtual sessions, and it's all about how we're grappling with trying to manage the mediated access piece. I think like at NYU, my experience has been like, we weren't really reorganized recently, but we sort of kind of were. Like my business library team was the least reorganized. But we're thinking about our teams at NYU in terms of like strong and weak bonds between teams. And so one of the reasons why we hired a business data librarian is because we wanted to create a strong bond with our data services unit. And so the idea is percolate data proficiencies into our liaison or subject disciplinary librarian teams so that it's not located in one place. It's kind of like diversity, like not having diversity in one standalone goal. We're having standalone diversity goals, and we're having diversity woven through all of our other goals as well. So that's been our approach, but I mean, it's very much like we're not even at the proof of concept stage for that, right? It's like alpha kind of thing. Erin, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we're sort of in the same situation at Yale, and there is sort of Yale's a university of many silos, and one of the things that we're working on right now is taking multiple disparate services that are sort of data and computational in nature and combining them into a more cohesive unit that can be sort of more approachable and solve more problems for more people. So we're still figuring it out as well. And figuring out what are the right university institutes, departments, and stakeholders that we should also be participating with to make this as good as we can.
I think Jennifer in the back had the next question.
Yes. So one thing that I know, kind of going back to the multiple ways of getting the same information, is prioritizing if you have limited funds. Something we ran into was PitchBook. You have the PitchBook that the entire campus can access, and then you have the PitchBook data stream that the 5 faculty members want to use, and they cost the same amount. So, do you have anything when you're having those conversations about where the library prioritizes access, like student and teaching access versus research access, when there's really no layover between the two? So that's kind of something, are you discussing those things explicitly in policies?
I would say we're not explicitly doing it in policy, because as I mentioned, like a policy document is kind of empty. But I would say that like we're thinking it through every day. And the thing that brought this on initially was thinking about our commitment to the Words platform, which is a data aggregator platform where you can subscribe to different data products within it. And traditionally the business school had only purchased in that product. And we eventually made the decision like, yeah, we're going to pitch in and we're going to be buying this product as well. And I think like oftentimes we may be a little too hyper-focused on like research or we might be hyper-focused on like reference applications or instruction applications and kind of saying like the school needs to think or the researcher needs to think about the research piece.
Right.
And I think like that's what this presentation is trying to unspool, which is that like we don't want to policy ourselves out into irrelevance when it comes to these types of data products. And I would say like missteps have been made. Like we have overcommitted to products in the past and had to back away from them. Right now we're overcommitting to PitchBook. We're getting 5 researcher accounts that will be cycling people into and out of. PhD students and faculty members. Because like at NYU, we have faculty members that are like fully funded with research funds. We don't have to worry about them. But what about the PhD students that don't have that funding or don't have access to funding through their instructor? And so a lot of it, I think, is now being driven by our values. So like that idea of the library as an equalizer within the system, I think like that's what is forcing, well, maybe not forcing, but making me think about what my role is in terms of my collection development responsibilities. And it's making me be a little bit bolder when it comes to licensing the products. Because I don't want our, like you mentioned, for example, the value add. Like the value add, if we already have PitchBook and we're only 2 steps away or 1 step away from making this something that will make someone's dissertation amazing, like let's do it, especially if we have the money. Which we do for this one.
And I would also just say, I think another way of thinking about it that might get more buy-in from within the library itself, and also, so thinking about the individual schools, like the B schools, DEIB commitments, or things like that. So if part of the problem of broadening and getting more voices and diverse voices in scholarship is to get more faculty, you get more faculty by having more diverse PhD students. We want to really make them be successful so that when they can publish and are no longer PhD students but are faculty, we've given them and set the stage for success. We've given the best resources we can and we've set the stage for success. So if we can try to tie it into that, I think it will resonate a little bit more.
Yeah. A question here. Thank you for using the microphones.
A little bit selfish because I am head of metadata at West Virginia University. We have just started thinking about building out public-facing data services, and so having a little bit of identity issues around which are the internal-facing data services that are kind of still under my purview, and which are the ones that are outward-facing. Could you speak to how I could navigate that that transition in politics effectively?
That's a good one, and I think like it's probably institution specific. I would say like one thing we've done at NYU is think about like what is the most logical home. And so for example, with these workflows, they're not probably going to end up in our collections unit. Like we haven't built these workflows yet, we're just doing the work. And so even though like our collections unit holds all the money and it has all of the expertise, it's probably going to be our data services unit that is actually like advising and approving a lot of these workflows and mainstreaming it into our practice. And that's the kind of thing where I'm like, wow, these senior leaders have a good working relationship to being able to say like, this is not my area of expertise. Like, please, your team, take this on, and we're going to back you up on it. And similarly, like our cataloging unit is being onboarded in this way too. And so like that's the NYU way, but I think like there's probably like multiple discussions that you get to have at your institution to figure out like how do we actually get this work done? Where do we have capacity to grow this? You know, like what do we need to stop doing to do this? Or like any of those like conceptual things about thinking through like launching. And that's why we say thinking of it as a mediated service and not just as collections, because when you just think about it as collections, you get into that mindset of I buy this and I put this here and I'm done. But that doesn't hold true for any of these products. It's all supported all the time in perpetuity, which, yeah, exactly, yeah. Your green thumb, yeah. So that's what I would say. I think like Purdue has really fantastic workflows for this already set up. So I would say like reach out to people at Purdue. And then there are a lot of people with like Dataverse implementations where Dataverse makes some of this stuff easy. So we're not a Dataverse organization at NYU, but I think like there are those data repository discovery platforms that some may be better than others. I don't actually know what those are yet. Okay. Thank you. In the back?
Yep. There we are. hesitate to say this, but I'm from Virginia Tech. A money talks perspective here. This conversation reminds me a lot of a presentation several years ago here about mostly Michigan and a little bit of Illinois investing what amounts to a subvention fund to buy access for the campus to at least certain proprietary data sets. I have not followed up on that, and I'd be curious. The other part, though, given some of the speculation we'll hear about tomorrow, is if our researchers are using these streaming systems, I'm the history guy, so I think in terms of closed-end archival sets, but if our researchers are going for these streaming sources, what is the OSTP requirement going to do to persuade those vendors? And how do we train them?
Mm-hmm. I'd throw that one open to the room. Yeah, I mean, there are more unknowns than knowns, I would say. And like, one thing that I would add is, one thing that led to this presentation, we were just talking about it beforehand, was at Vanderbilt, Kelly LaVoice's boss, Hillary, what's Hillary's last name? Hillary Craiglow. She, many years ago, was one of the first people to license one of these API products and present on it. And it's really only now that, for example, like my organization has been able to systemize it as something that we can give access to as a mediated product. And it's interesting, Stanford just subscribed and they reached out to me. And we talked through like, oh, this is how you manage access. These are all the common problems that come up. And I said like, and the reason I know this is because Hillary at Vanderbilt was the one who told me everything that I needed to know. Yeah. So that's just kind of a related anecdote. Any other questions? Any other comments? Stories, war stories?
Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.